Please welcome back to the stage Daniel Bogata.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. As obviously a tough watch, a moving watch, an important watch, I think, and I'm sure that there's quite a few people in this audience to which this is largely new story, and no sort of vaguely the outline of 9/11, but this is a new generation that you're bringing this tale to. Not so new for me. I remember it very well from paying attention to the earliest moments when they thought it was a light passenger aircraft. I wanted to start with asking you about the extraordinary archive that's the backbone of this particular episode, which is Lieutenant Pfeiffer's story. And clearly there was a film crew already following him to look at maybe, I don't know, tell us what that archive is, because and it's amazing how they continue to carry on what I assume is maybe a single camera person.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, so basically the archive team, started working before I even joined the project. And the main mission was just to get together all the sources they could find. Some of them, sources that have been used on other documentaries, some of them sources that, were lying in a drawer for many years and nobody had ever seen before. So that particular footage that's following Pfeiffer is from two guys called Jules Naudet, and his brother Gideon. And they were doing a documentary they had been filming for weeks about firefighters in New York. They were filming in particular like a rookie firefighter and the journey that he does to, there's like a probation period, and so they're following him. That was the purpose of the thing. And on that particular morning, Jules, which was the brother that was learning how to film, he went out with Pfeiffer just to kind of test his skills. And so that's kind of what he's doing. He's just practicing. It was just, for weeks, not much had happened. And then when the plane hit, he just kept filming. And so, and then the other brother was at the station, and he also filmed some stuff. So their material was put together on a documentary that came out the year after 9/11. It was different from this because their main focus was kind of the rookie firefighter, so that was kind of the framing of the story. But the archive, we had access to all of the rushes, and so in this project it's sort of reframed because it's 6 episodes, and their material is just used, I think, until the 4th episode, and then together with a lot of other sources.
So as you said, you've made this with 72 films. 72 Films has a reputation for developing these really powerful, like present tense narrative archive series, having done so for like House of Assad and Trump.
Yeah.
And they have a real expertise in it. Talk us a little bit briefly just through how obviously you're collecting all the rushes, you say, how do you begin to then pull out and find the contributors and the storylines when there's so much material there that you're dealing with?
So yeah, I think like the great thing about this project is that it was given time. And so, often you work on a documentary and, the archive is sometimes even an afterthought, and the treatment is written first, and you get interviews with contributors, and then the archive is just basically illustrating what the contributors are saying. And here, because the archive team had begun earlier, we were working together as we were writing the treatment and selecting the stories. We knew it was going to be archive-led. And so we knew that, not all stories had to have somebody who was in archive. For instance, the chef, you don't see him in archive, at least not in the film. But then others like Pfeiffer, the chief, he would be in archive quite a lot. And so when you're putting together the treatment of how this episode's going to work, you're thinking, okay, we've got this bit of archive here. And then, for instance, and so as the team of archive is working, new stuff is coming in, and they're showing it to us, and the whole team gets around the computer, and we watch the archive. And then we think, oh, wow, that's very powerful. So, for instance, the helicopter sequence, you get the helicopter sequence, and you immediately think, right, we should get like the pilot to tell us his story, and we research what his story is. And then we think, right, so how does one thing connect to the other? And you think, okay, well, maybe, this is the sequence of the people falling, and then Pfeiffer makes this appeal for them to wait, and maybe we cut there to the helicopter as they go. And then here's the importance of just researching a lot and reading as much as you can and watching everything you can. And I think, I don't know if it was me or Caroline, but at one point we saw the story of people trapped on the 89th floor, and one of them says, we saw the helicopter and we waved at it, and we just go, right. So maybe then from the helicopter, it goes to the person trapped in there. And so then there were 5 people in that story, and the difficult thing is just kind of trying to find them and then trying to convince them. And I think some of the researchers who did that work are here in the audience. It was really, really difficult. And we got very lucky quite at the end. We managed to track down Lynn Simpson, and she said yes. And so then the whole thing just works. But you have to plan it in advance, have like a structure. And so then when we talk to the editors, we say, okay, well, this is the plan. This goes from that to that. And then they just kind of do the magic of making it all really flow and feel seamless. But we wouldn't have been able to do that if it wasn't planned in advance, right? Because I'm interviewing the helicopter pilot, so that moment when they're seeing the faces, that's a very important moment. So we need to get that. And then Lynn Simpson, we need to get that moment clearly. But another idea I had was that for Lynn Simpson then to she made her phone call, so then for her to kind of pass it on to the other phone calls that we knew we wanted to show as well. And so there I have to explain to her a bit the concept that we don't have any narration, so maybe you could explain that there were other phone calls, and then she does that, and then that connects. So and this had to be like for the whole series, from episode 1 to episode 6. We had to think of all the stories, of how they connect. And it was really just kind of a first draft in a way, the treatments, and then you do the interviews. Because then when the edit came, then you saw what worked and what didn't work, and you adjusted accordingly.
I'm a little bit late in mentioning this, but most of you know the drill by now, that you should submit questions through Slido. I don't have any yet, so it's possible there's a kink in it, but I have plenty of my own, so that's okay. But please do, if you have any questions, submit it through that. Can I ask you a little bit about the interview process then? I think probably, I'm guessing some people were quite familiar with telling this story, and some people hadn't told it in some time. And how do you approach doing such a sensitive interview with people that, no matter that it's 20 years ago, would have been the most traumatic days of their lives?
I think we had a sense that we wanted the interviews to feel special, to be special. We wanted to feel that people, in a way, you're sitting with somebody and they said, I was there, and they start telling you their story, and it feels like they're sitting right in front of you and they're bearing their heart out. And so in a way, it's not the usual interview for a documentary. And it's interesting you're talking about this next generation, because that was an important part of the pitch. Like we would, at the beginning, I started asking around some very young people, like people in their 20s, early 20s, what they knew about 9/11. Because I was 20 years old when it happened, so I had a very good memory of it. And actually, I was quite surprised by a lot of people knew almost next to nothing, and I was really surprised by that. And when it happens, people said never forget, and one of the things that you think is, well, how could anybody ever forget? And here we are 20 years later, and there's a new generation, and I'm asking around, and they don't know much. And so part of the mission of this project was, so we want to make a series that's landmark, that's big, that's compelling, that's very watchable, but also has this kind of all these messages within when you're telling the story. And so when we approached the contributors, that was part of the pitch. We said, listen, this is going to be landmark. We want it to be big. National Geographic are really doing a big push to get the archive right, to get everything right. And so this is not going to be the usual interview. We want you to take the whole day, block the whole day off. The cameras take about 3 hours to set up. We want it to look really, really, like cinematography to be really great. And then we want you to sit down, relax, tell the story. You'll be looking directly at the camera through the iDirect. Do a first pass, and then we'll have a break. Then we'll come back. We'll kind of profit. So we just a lot of time, and for them to feel relaxed, that they can tell their story with comfort. And I think the fact that we kind of had explained all of this, and we had explained the legacy aspect of the thing. There were some interviews, like for instance, Jay Jonas was the guy who talks about all the people that he shook hands and that they're all dead. He appears again later in another episode with a very compelling story, and he's kind of the center of that story, and it's a story called The Miracle in the Stairwell. And so that story, there had already been a number of documentaries, and I had seen them. And when he was being interviewed in them, he had almost I wouldn't say a casual, but he had a way of speaking where it was a bit of a rehearsed story, and he was just going through it. And we wanted to avoid that. We didn't want that for people to feel that they're just. And I think it was part of their approach, that, perhaps the setting up, perhaps the idea that this is just bigger than a normal documentary. And so for Jay Jonas, for instance, a good example that we were just absolutely stunned at how, he really did bear his heart out. And episode 5 just really works because he's the heart of that episode. And it happened again and again and again with so many contributors. We would have the interview and then we would call back. It was just amazing. It's just extraordinary. So there was just, something special about the project. And we went incredibly well prepared for the interview. We had a whole team of researchers. We prepared a document. We made sure what were the key things that we absolutely needed to get. But at the same time, we wanted people to feel free to start talking about something that happened last week, and that they, reminded just to have a freedom to go wherever they wanted. We had the time and the space for that, and also that if they didn't feel comfortable talking about something, that was fine. We were not going to press them. In essence, what we wanted to do was give them a platform to share their story, and that's what we tried to provide.
As part of that process, did you show them any of the archive?
Yes, so usually we did it at the end. So and there was an idea at some point, we filmed a bit of it, of them watching the archive, but that was a bit too meta, so we didn't use it in the end. But they were shown. In things which was a bit more specific, where it was important, we might show them to it first, like Pfeiffer, for instance. We had a meeting with him before anything, and we went through all the archives, so he could explain that's that guy, that's what's happening here, as we were writing the treatment, because we didn't want to miss something important.
Right. I've got a question here from Dawn. This episode was first response. Can you talk about what parts of the day the other episodes will focus on?
Yeah, actually, that's a good question. It was, I think part of the reason there has never been like a 6-part series on it is like, there's another documentary called 102 Minutes, and there's a book called 102 Minutes. And the reason of that number is the amount of time that happened from the first plane hitting to the second tower collapsing is 102 minutes. And in reality, like most of some of the more compelling stories, some of the more life and death stories happen within that period of time. And you realize, well, 6 episodes is 6 hours. So how are we going to do 6 hours about 102 minutes? Because a lot of the stories overlapped. And so there was a fundamental paradox in doing something that felt minute by minute, and at the same time, you're moving ahead in time, but how are you going to do it through 6 episodes? The original treatment, what Nat Geo got, was something that said there would be a lot of graphics and a lot of things like that, and so we just said, no, we don't want that. And so the solution was this. We would begin a story and say, this is from this time to this time. Like, so this one is like from 5:30 to 9 a.m. And then episode 2 is going to begin later. It's going to be later today, but it's not going to pick up where episode 1 finished. It's going to pick up at the beginning of episode 2. One plane has already hit, right? And so you're a little bit further there. And we're going to follow a few other characters, paramedics, and the idea is that, like, you introduce a number of stories where their narrative arc resolves within that episode, so it has a beginning, a middle, and end. So, for instance, Ron Clifford, Lynn Simpson, you meet them, something happens, and their story is resolved, and then you have characters like Jay Jonas, Pfeiffer, who you meet, and you'll see them again in other episodes, and you'll follow their story more throughout the episodes. So episode 2, for instance, one tower has already been hit, and finishes basically at the point of collapse. And it's more from the perspective of the South Tower. And then episode 3 moves like a few minutes before the collapse, and it's mostly about the collapse, the first collapse. And episode 4, second collapse. And episode 5, rescue operations in the morning. Episode 6, rescue operations in the afternoon. So we're kind of inching along throughout the day, and that's how we did it.
Oh, interesting. I've got a few more questions here. Is there any footage you refuse to use for moral reasons or otherwise? And if so, why?
It's interesting because there is some footage which is gory, and we wouldn't want to have used it anyhow, but it's not a lot. Just in terms of seeing kind of blood or bits of bodies on the street. For us, it was important the film, all of them, was not sanitized. It did represent the reality of what happened and the shock of what happened, and that people got that. At the same time, we didn't want the films to be relentlessly grim, to be something that would just be almost impossible to watch. And so we felt that we had to do a balance. And in terms of gore, I thought, I just don't see gore as necessary. And again, there wasn't that much of it filmed. For instance, the Norday brothers who went in, they decided not to film dead bodies, and so they turn their camera away from them. So that's in terms of footage, but just in general, in terms of the kind of stories as well, and the kind of things that people say in their stories, there was also a balance. Every single one of these interviews, which lasted 4 hours, do describe a lot of horrific things, and we just had to kind of do a balance where, like with Kevin Leary, he's talking about all the body's parts that he saw, and that was important, but it just couldn't be a film from beginning to end, people are just describing those kind of things. And the thing that brought the balance, and that was probably most important for all of us, was to show the humanity, to show like the decency, the kindness, the sacrifice, the bravery. In the film, you see Ron Clifford putting Jenny Ann in the ambulance on that shot. There's another documentary called 102 Minutes, which is one of the more famous 9/11 documentaries, which was done in 2006. And what they did, it was just archive, which is a great idea. It was just from beginning to end archive, but there's no narration, there's no story, you're just going through just archive. And in that film, it does include that bit where you saw Ron Clifford putting Jenny Ann in the ambulance. And so the idea of this is like, actually, if you knew Ron Clifford's story, you'd be amazed. It's just one of the most extraordinary stories you can imagine. So an archive-only approach does have its benefits. It puts you there. It has its limits that, you see somebody putting in an ambulance and you don't know what the story is. So the purpose of this project was kind of to marry both things, to the oral testimony with the archive. So when he's putting Jenny Ann in the ambulance, you know exactly, the whole backstory, what it means, and then you follow him home to, for the horrific thing he discovered there. And so he was trying to bring the best of oral testimony with the best of archive. And early on, when we were watching archive, we would sit around and watch a computer, and it was just very mesmerizing. Everybody would just stay silently watching it. And so we just realized we should let this play long. We shouldn't be cutting, because it's just more effective that way. And then in terms of the oral testimony, we were just like, all these stories are just extraordinary. And so our mission is to get out of the way. We don't need narrator. We don't need our own thoughts. We don't need that. We just need to create a structure where we can put together the archive, make it work with the oral testimony, and make it feel seamless. And that's what we try to do.
This kind of, because you were just talking about one of the other films, another question is asking, did you ignore, or I would say pay attention to what other films have done or are doing, and were you trying to be sort of the definitive record, or how much did those other films inform your thinking?
I mean, I watched everything. Actually, even before agreeing to participate, I tried to watch as many 9/11 documentaries, because I didn't want to do something that had been done before. And I sort of felt, well, if I watch a documentary that is sort of this, then I would just say, well, I just think it's been done really well with that documentary. I don't know what we can bring to the table. But we watch, and there are a lot of great 9/11 documentaries, but I think this has the benefit of being a series, and so it's a much wider canvas, and so you can do more with it. And so it informed me in a sense to see what was already there and to think, okay, I want to offer something new, and I think this is something different from what has been done before.
A question here. I recall the shock of people flying down from the windows, but the sequence of bodies crashing on the roof was even harder. Was it emotionally taxing for you? And in general, of course, you're watching a lot of very difficult footage. What kind of protections do you put in for yourself and the archive researchers?
So we had kind of a specialist person who advises production teams on what are the kind of best procedures for taking care of yourself and your colleagues when watching this type of archive. I mean, I have a background working on current affairs and lots of human rights type stories. I've actually been to Warsaw and filmed, dead bodies and those kind of things. And so I just knew from personal experience, and also of editing a lot of, very, very horrific things and finding a way to say it. And that sequence, yeah, it was a difficult sequence. You have to figure out how do we tell this story. And like the Memorial Museum was a place that helped us with the archive, but it was also a source of inspiration of what's the best approach, because they obviously had given a lot of thought about how do we inform and educate people about this horrific tragedy in a way that's sensitive, but that does not shy away of showing the reality. And so, for instance, like just with that sequence, we went to see what they did. They had a room for that, and that kind of inspired. And like a lot of the film is just kind of, it plays out in real time, and we realized with that sequence we couldn't do that. And so instead, it's all framed from the perspective of Ed Fahey, and he kind of prepares you for what you're going to see. At the same time, we thought it was important to show it because, if you were alive at the time, you would have seen it on television, and it is part of the story. It is part of what happened. But we tried to do it with as much sensitivity as possible.
We have to wrap up in a minute, so I'm just going to end with a question of my own. How you said you were 20 years old when 9/11 happened, so how has this informed your understanding of the events?
How working on it?
Yes.
I mean, it's interesting because I thought I knew a lot about 9/11, and then when I started working on the project, I realized I knew next to nothing. I'd seen a few documentaries, I've read a few books, but when you start, or at least when I start a project, I try to make my mind blank. I don't know anything, therefore I need to learn as much as I can. And the second thing is, like, what is the purpose of this? When David Glover had pitched it, he said, this is going to show how, it was going to show the worst of humanity and the best of humanity, and the heroism and the sacrifice and the bravery. We'll have all these kind of extraordinary stories. And my sense is, well, we will if that's what we find out. Like for me, for documentary making, the truth has to be your guiding light. That has to be what you're after. And so as we started doing this research, these stories of bravery and sacrifice and kindness and empathy and all these extraordinary things that happen, what you're seeing is representative of what really was happening throughout. There are thousands of stories like that. And so I felt very comfortable at that point of saying, the structure more or less of every film is towards the end, you always move to the heroism and the sacrifice, and you highlight that. And every single film does that, like this one too.
Oh, well, we're out of time, but can I thank you for this? We'll look forward to seeing, although I'll have to steel myself to see the rest of the series, but congratulations on it, and to your team, many of whom are here today. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, everyone.